Welcome to Roosterville, USA, where we explore the people, places, and forgotten stories that shaped our corner of America. And when you ask someone to picture the beginning of the American West, a very specific image usually pops into their head.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost always like a jagged line of snow-capped Rocky Mountains, right?
Right, yeah. Or maybe a lone rider kicking up dust in some desolate Red Rock Canyon.
Exactly. It's a very Hollywood image.
It really is. But today, we are going to challenge that image. We're asking a pretty fundamental question for you to think about. Where did the American West actually truly begin?
And to answer that, we really have to pull our focus away from the mountains entirely. We need to look at Missouri in the 1840s.
Yeah, because at that specific moment in time, Missouri wasn't just, another state. It was this physical hinge between the settled United States and the vast overland West.
That's a great way to put it. The hinge.
And to figure out how that hinge actually functioned, we're going to follow one very specific journey from the spring of 1841.
Right. And our deep dive today relies on a set of source materials that give us two distinct and honestly sometimes conflicting layers of history.
Yeah, it's fascinating. First, we have the first-hand 1841 letters and observations of Pierre-Jean De Smet. He was a Jesuit missionary who actually made the trek himself.
Right. And then the second layer, which is what makes this material so incredibly compelling, is the historical background notes. These were provided 65 years later in 1906 by an editor named Reuben Gold Thwaites.
So you get two totally different perspectives.
Exactly. De Smet gives us the raw, on-the-ground experience, what he smelled, what he saw, and his own highly specific worldview.
While Thwaites acts more like a macro lens, he zooms out to explain the historical, economic, and political mechanics that were operating beneath the surface of De Smet's journey.
Yeah, he gives us the big picture.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our journey begins with De Smet sitting down to write a letter on February 4th, 1841.
And he's not in some rustic log cabin on the frontier.
No, not at all. He is writing from St. Louis University. And when I read through these notes, my brain immediately went to, modern space exploration.
Really, space exploration.
Yeah, St. Louis in 1841 feels less like a sleepy river town and more like mission control for the frontier.
I can definitely see the comparison you're drawing there, though, we do have to be careful not to project too much modernity onto an 1840s river city.
Yeah, for sure. But what makes me see it as mission control is just the sheer scale of the infrastructure. You didn't just wander into the unknown.
Right, you needed a launch pad.
Exactly, you need a launch pad. St. Louis was where the massive fur trade connections were headquartered.
It was where these incredibly dangerous, complex expeditions were financed.
Yeah, and where you secured religious backing and gathered the literal manpower to just survive the trip. De Smet himself was sent west by the Bishop of St. Louis and his Jesuit superior.
Right, to see if a mission could be established way out near the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
So when you frame it around the concentration of capital and logistics, the spaceport analogy holds up quite well.
I think so, too. It was the hub for everything.
And St. Louis wasn't just projecting influence outward either. It was this diplomatic gravity, drawing people in.
Yeah, De Smet's letters document that native delegations were traveling enormous distances, like crossing half the continent, specifically to reach St. Louis.
He notes that 4 such delegations had attempted the journey in the previous decade alone.
And the stakes for those trips were literally life and death. De Smet mentioned some travelers died from disease along the way.
Yeah, and one delegation was actually killed before they could even arrive. It was incredibly dangerous.
It was. But I do want to stop and look at why they were traveling all that way. Because De Smet claims they were coming specifically to request Catholic missionaries.
Right, and that is where we have to explicitly separate our two historical lenses. De Smet interpreted those visits through a strictly religious worldview.
Because that was his whole purpose for being there.
Exactly. He viewed these grueling, dangerous journeys as a pure spiritual quest for his specific faith. But when we apply Thwaites' broader historical context from 1906, we have to recognize that De Smet wasn't a neutral reporter.
Right, we have to remain objective about what the sources tell us.
We do. Those native delegations were navigating a rapidly destabilizing continent. Their motives for seeking alliances in a major power center like St. Louis were likely rooted in complex social, political, and survival strategies, not just a religious awakening.
So St. Louis is the headquarters. It's the place where the money, the motives, and the people all collide, but you still have to actually leave.
You do.
And just like a space launch relies on heavy booster rockets to get off the pad, the Western Trail story didn't start with wagons. It started on the water.
It really did. In April 1841, De Smet boards a steamboat named the Oceana.
And according to Thwaites' 1906 notes, the Oceana was built in 1836 and weighed about 300 tons.
300 tons. Just wrap your head around that.
It's massive. I think this shatters a huge misconception for a lot of people.
How so?
Well, when we picture the Western migration, we instantly picture wooden wheels and oxen.
Right, the classic covered wagon.
Exactly. We don't picture missionaries and fur traders loading literal tons of supplies onto a massive steam-powered industrial machine that's pushing against a river current.
Yeah, the overland trails were strictly the second leg of the journey. The first leg required moving up a massive interconnected network of rivers.
And De Smet's writings make it clear that this wasn't just a simple matter of floating up a single channel.
Oh, not at all. It was a complex web. It included the Kansas, the Grand, the Chariton, the Osage, the Gasconade, and many others.
So why the water? Like, if the ultimate goal is to go overland, why not just pack the wagons in St. Louis and start walking?
That comes down to sheer friction and weight. Moving hundreds of tons of trade goods, timber, and supplies over unpaved, muddy Missouri ground in early spring.
Sounds like a nightmare.
It would require an impossible amount of animal power and time. The river network was the only mechanism capable of handling that industrial capacity. You use the river to carry the heaviest burden for as long as geographically possible.
Which makes total sense. So the Oceana steams up this intricate river highway for 7 days, but the water eventually runs out, or at least it stops going in the direction you need it to go.
Right.
On April 30th, 1841, the steamboat drops De Smet off at what he considers the absolute western edge of the United States. He arrives at Westport.
And when we read De Smet's 1841 account, Westport is presented as a raw frontier town. It's the end of the line.
You step off the steamboat, the organized American settlement just stops, and you're basically staring at the edge of the map.
But Thwaites' historical context intervenes here to show us the actual mechanics of how Westport came to exist. It didn't just organically sprout out of the dirt at the edge of the frontier.
Right, there is always a very deliberate chain of events that dictates where a town gets built, especially a logistical hub.
Thwaites traces it back to 1821, when Pierre-Jean Jr. established a trading agency right in the Missouri River bottom.
But the problem there is river bottoms flood.
They do. And when that inevitably happened, the operation had to move to higher, safer ground, which became known as Choteau's warehouse.
Okay, so they moved up.
Right. Then by 1831, a man named John McCoy saw the spatial advantage of the area and built a trading house where the local inland roads intersected.
Because if you have the roads intersecting, you capture the traffic before it even hits the water.
Precisely. 2 years later, in 1833, McCoy legally mapped out and subdivided the land around his trading house, a process called platting, and officially established the town of Westport.
Wait, hold on. This completely upends my mental map of the area.
How so?
Well, Westport is booming inland, but where does Kansas City fit into this timeline? Wasn't Kansas City the primary hub?
It was not. In fact, Kansas City was essentially born out of sheer logistical desperation on the part of Westport.
Wait, really? You're telling me a major American city started as an afterthought for a different town?
What's fascinating here is, if you think about the mechanics of moving 300-ton steamboats, Westport was an inland settlement.
Right.
It initially relied on Choteau's warehouse as its connection to the river. But as the overland trade exploded, the traffic simply outgrew the infrastructure.
The muddy riverbanks just couldn't handle the constant loading and unloading of heavy cargo.
Exactly. Westport desperately needed a dependable, rocky riverbank landing to support the massive steamboats coming from St. Louis.
So they basically had to go out and buy a better parking spot.
That is exactly what happened. In 1838, a company purchased and platted a completely new site on a rocky stretch of the river purely to serve Westport's inland trade.
And they called that new town site Kansas City.
They did. It wasn't founded as a grand, isolated metropolis. It was an infrastructure solution, a practical river outlet designed to service an already thriving inland network.
Wow, that completely changes how you view the region. It wasn't a bunch of isolated pioneer cabins. It was a highly sophisticated transportation network connecting the capital of St. Louis, the river arteries, and the rocky landing of Kansas City to the inland hub of Westport.
It really was a machine.
But before we follow De Smet out of Westport, we have to address the ground he was actually standing on, because the idea that he was stepping off the boat into an empty wilderness is a complete myth.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where relying strictly on De Smet's 1841 perspective would give us a deeply flawed understanding of the West.
Right, we have to look at the broader context.
To understand the reality of the frontier, we really must rely on Thwaites' 1906 editorial notes. He details an 1833 treaty that involved roughly 5 million acres of land.
5 million acres changing hands just a few years before De Smet arrives. That's huge.
Yes, and this massive tract was previously held by the Potawatomi, the Ottawa, and the Chippewa.
So the frontier wasn't just this geographical line that Americans were simply walking across?
No, it was a volatile, heavily contested zone of displacement. We're just reporting what the historical records show here, but the reality is undeniable.
Right. How did that actually play out on the ground for the tribes? Because, a treaty on paper is one thing, but the physical movement of people is another.
The mechanics of that displacement were brutal and continuous. The Potawatomi, for instance, were initially assigned land between Missouri's western border and the Missouri River.
So they were squeezed into this pocket of land right up against the river.
Temporarily, yes.
Mm-hmm.
That specific area became known as the Platte Purchase Territory.
Yeah.
But that tract of land was then formally incorporated into the state of Missouri in 1836.
Which meant the tribe was forced off that land and moved yet again.
Exactly.
That is a staggering realization. The infrastructure we just talked about, like the roads connecting McCoy's trading house, the farms supplying the caravans, the town of Westport itself.
Yeah.
All of this rapid expansion was built directly on top of a highly active history of native land cessions and forced removals.
The map was constantly being erased and redrawn. The edge of the frontier that De Smet wrote about was only the edge for the Americans arriving from the east.
Right.
For the native nations, this wasn't an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was the center of a rapidly collapsing and shifting world. The land was literally being cleared to make way for the logistics of Western expansion.
Which brings us back to De Smet. He is standing in Westport in the spring of 1841. The steamboat is gone. He's surrounded by this massive logistical hub built on recently acquired land.
Right.
How does a single missionary actually prepare to leave it? I'm assuming you don't just throw a bag over your shoulder and start walking west.
Oh, absolutely not. That would be a guaranteed death sentence.
Right, I'd imagine.
To survive the journey beyond Westport, you had to embed yourself in a larger system.
Yeah.
So De Smet joined the annual American Fur Company expedition.
Okay.
This specific caravan was commanded by Andrew Drips, who was a veteran St. Louis man. He'd actually helped form the Missouri Fur Company 20 years earlier, back in 1820.
Wow, so even out at the absolute edge of Westport, all roads still lead back to St. Louis capital and influence.
St. Louis dictated the entire rhythm of the trade. And Thwaites' notes give us a fascinating timeline of how the mechanics of that trade evolved.
How so?
Well, before 1822, expeditions moving west were mostly men carrying goods in literal packs on their backs.
Walking hundreds of miles while hauling trade goods on your own spine?
Yeah.
The sheer physical toll of that is unimaginable.
It was incredibly inefficient, which is why it didn't last. They quickly transitioned to using pack horses to carry the burden.
That makes more sense.
But the demand for goods and the massive distance they needed to travel kept scaling up. So by the early 1830s, just a decade later, organized wagon caravans became the almost exclusive method for major overland trade.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. This shift in logistics is wild.
It's a huge jump.
In roughly 10 years, you go from guys hiking with heavy backpacks to organizing what were essentially convoys of armored RVs.
That's a great way to think of it.
Because these wagon caravans weren't just vehicles, they were highly structured, highly defended mobile communities, right?
They had to be. They developed strict militaristic systems for how they set up camps, how they managed their livestock, and how they posted guards.
Wow.
And that rapid, dramatic shift in technology from a backpack to a massive wagon was completely driven by the environment they were about to enter.
This is the moment I've been waiting for. The wagons are packed. The guards are posted. De Smet physically leaves Westport. What does he actually see? Does the environment just suddenly snap from one thing to another?
It was an abrupt, almost violent transition in the landscape. Throughout Missouri and all along the River Highway, travelers were surrounded by familiar, timber-heavy country.
All right, lots of trees.
The trees provided shelter, fuel, and a sense of enclosure.
Yeah.
But beyond Westport, the trees simply vanished.
Just gone.
Just gone. They clung only to scattered creeks. The landscape suddenly opened up into rolling grasslands that seemed to stretch into infinity beneath an enormous sky.
De Smet has this haunting, beautiful description of it in his letters. He looks out at this immense treeless plain, watching the tall grass rolling and pitching in the wind, and he compares it to a storm-driven sea. He
Yes.
literally dubs it the Prairie Ocean.
The Prairie Ocean. And if we lean into that nautical metaphor, it perfectly explains the mechanics of survival out there.
Yeah.
Just like an actual ocean, this landscape dictated every single aspect of human movement.
Because there's nothing out there.
Exactly. Thwaites points out that because grass completely dominated the land between Westport and the Platte River, the extreme scarcity of water and timber became the absolute ruling force of the journey.
It changes the entire concept of travel. You aren't just taking a road trip where you can pull over when you get tired.
Not at all.
If there is no wood for a fire to cook or boil water and no stream to drink from, you can't stop.
You have to keep moving toward the next island of resources, or you die. This raises an important question for us today.
What's that?
Imagine the sheer psychological impact of that transition. You leave the shadows of the Missouri timber. You leave the constant reassuring presence of the river network. And suddenly you step out into a void.
It must have been terrifying.
You are no longer navigating by following a riverbank. You are navigating a vast horizon. In St. Louis, or even in Westport, humanity was dominating the landscape, building warehouses, platting towns, directing steamboats.
Right.
But the moment you stepped into the Prairie Ocean, the landscape dominated you.
So what does this all mean? If we pull all these threads together from De Smet's 1841 letters and Thwaites' 1906 historical notes, what is the ultimate picture of this transportation network? How did it all fit together?
If we synthesize the mechanics of the journey, we're really looking at a massive three-part machine.
Okay.
First, you have St. Louis. That was the brain, the funding, the starting line.
Mission control. Exactly. Second, you had Independence, which De Smet actually utilized on his return journey. Independence functioned as the vital transport connection, linking the raw trail country back to established Missouri. And finally, you had Westport.
The final departure point, the port at the edge of the sea.
Exactly. Westport was the final launch pad before entering the void. Which brings us back to the central question we asked at the very beginning of this deep dive. Where did the American West really begin?
Right.
Based on the logistics, the treaties, and the first-hand shock of travelers in 1841, the West did not begin somewhere out in the distant snow-capped Rocky Mountains.
No, it didn't.
For many 19th century travelers, the true American West began the very moment they left the safety of Westport, left the timber behind, and stepped foot into the Prairie Ocean.
It was the definitive boundary between the world they had engineered and the world they simply had to survive.
Yeah.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If the harsh environment of that Prairie Ocean completely dictated human movement, strictly based on the brutal scarcity of timber and water, how much of our modern American map was shaped not by grand human ambition or master planning, but simply by where desperate travelers were forced to stop for a drink of water?
The geography of thirst. That is an incredible way to look at a map. Thanks for joining us in Roosterville, USA. Please like, share, and subscribe, and watch the accompanying video, The Prairie Ocean Began at Westport.